I wanted to introduce our keynote speaker and talk about our session this morning. So our first session, social safety and human thriving. Social safety is the unconditional social connection, protection, and inclusion humans need to thrive. Stress and uncertainty resulting from a lack of social safety affects well-being, particularly for historically marginalized groups. And so this session will explore the impact of insufficient social safety on health disparities and outline trauma-informed approaches community members and partners can take to amplify and maintain social safety for community members. So I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa Diamond. She's a distinguished professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah and president of the International Academy for Sex Research. She received her PhD in human development from Cornell University in 1999 and has spent nearly 3 decades studying gender and sexual development and expression across the life course. Her current work focuses on the importance of social safety for the human immune system, as well as the negative long-term health impacts of living with chronic unsafety, especially for sexually and gender diverse individuals at different developmental stages. She is best known for her research on sexual fluidity, the capacity for individuals to experience unexpected shifts in sexual identity and expression over time. Her 2008 book, Sexual Fluidity, was awarded the Distinguished Book Award from the American Psychological Association Society for the Study of LGBTQ Issues. She is also the co-editor of the first ever APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, published in 2014, and a fellow of 2 divisions of the APA. Dr. Diamond has published over 140 articles and book chapters and has been invited to present her research at over 150 national and international universities and conferences. She has received awards for her work from the Developmental Psychology and LGBT Psychology divisions of the APA, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, the International Association for Relationship Research, the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. So we're very lucky and thankful to have Dr. Diamond, and we're going to turn the time over to you. Thanks.
Okay, let's see. Let me make sure. It's like I feel far away from the microphone, but can everyone hear me? Is this good? All right. So I wanted to start with this quote this is actually a couples counselor, Terry Real. He's got a lot of best-selling books on kind of couples functioning. And one of the things that he talks about in all of his books is just our sort of inherently social nature as a species, and that often when couples are wrangling with difficult topics, it's because there's nothing that's sort of more primal to our brains than our connections to others. And when those connections are not working well, we are not working well. And this quote that he gives just struck me. We are individuals, yes, but individuals whose lifeblood is connection, or individuals whose very existence is predicated on belonging. And one of the reasons I start with this is to point out that this is actually relatively new information in the field of psychology. Like, everyone always knew that, social relationships are important. But one of the things that we really now know over the past, sort of 2 decades of sort of social neuroendocrinology is that everything about our brains and our bodies is wired to sustain our connections to other individuals. We are the most social species on the planet. And, in the United States, we have this and in a lot of Western countries, but especially the US, we have a very individualistic culture. It's all about you and your identity and your expression and you do, and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you do this and you do that and you survive and you thrive. And we focus so much on the individual and not on the social context. And that is sort of upside down with regard to the way humans are as a species. And so one of the things that I sort of hope to leave you with is the degree to which our connections to other individuals, they don't just live in our heads, they are in our bodies, they're in our blood and in our immune systems. The functioning of your immune system right now is partly a function of the presence in your life of warm, affirmative individuals versus cold and rejecting individuals. Those aren't just things on the outside of our body, they are in our body. The social determinants of health are not external influences, they're actually biological influences. They operate from the inside out. And, I feel like once that data really started to come to the fore, it really changed everything that I thought about how stigma operates, about how relationships operate. Uh, and the other kind of good thing is it also gave me a sort of different sort of hope because it means that, yes, we have to make like institutional transformations in all these different domains, but it also means that we have a lot of ability to change our health and the health of the people around us by how we treat each other. That actually eliminating contempt from your life and increasing dignity is not just a kind of fuzzy, warm concept. It's actually a public health intervention. It's actually a biological intervention. And that's because of what we now know about how the immune system works. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about health disparities because we know that they exist. And I just want to start with sort of a snapshot of what they look like. These are data from the National Survey of Epidemiological Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions. So this is a big representative survey that's done, every number of years to get a sort of snapshot of what the health of various populations is. They have a lot of, substance measures, mental health measures. And so these, and it's a representative survey of around 40,000 individuals. So I'm going to show you women first, cisgender women. And so these are the percentages of the population. So representative snapshot of the US population of adults. How many have had a major depressive episode, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD symptomology, or a suicide attempt. So among heterosexually identified women, this is what you find for the rates of those conditions. And this is what you find for LGBTQ identified women. And not only, as you can see, are the rates greater, but they're specifically greater in bisexually identified populations. That's something that shows up and again. And initially, it was a big paradox in the field. We're like, well, if you're bisexual, you could probably kind of escape a lot of the victimization and discrimination that that more easily identifiable kind of gay people must experience. So you ought to be protected from the negative health effects of stigma. So why are we seeing like the reverse? And so for many years, the explanation was, they might be getting like a double dose of stigma. Some stigma from the gay community, some stigma from the straight community, and you add it all together and it makes for more stigma. It's certainly a reasonable explanation. But as you'll see in a second, I think there's a better explanation for this and some of the other disparities that we see. These are the data for men, similar, size of effects. And you see the same thing for health behaviors, right? These are rates for various health behaviors. These are the rates for men's. So it's bad. And you see similar disparities in almost any marginalized group. That's part of why this whole field of the social determinants of health really got going, because when you look at groups that are stigmatized or marginalized, they have poorer health, no matter where you look, in the United States, in other countries. Stigma is a health risk. And there's been a lot of effort to try to figure out, how does that happen? What is the mechanism through which something like your standing in a social group, how does that get under the skin and actually make you sicker, make you more depressed, make you more prone to substance use? So for many years, the theoretical explanation was minority stress. This was a phrase coined by Elan Meyer in the early 2000s with respect to at least the LGBTQ population. But the same basic idea had been circulating in the literature on racial and ethnic health disparities for years, and sometimes went under terms like weathering. This idea that something about your daily exposure to the stress of being a marginalized individual is shaping, the way that your body responds and changing your health over time. And, to some degree, this was a very sensible theory, because if you think about what is different about the lives of marginalized folks that could potentially increase their kind of negative health outcomes? And it's like, all the things that are associated with stress. You're more likely to be discriminated against, more likely to be harassed, more likely to have all these kind of negative things happen to you that psychologists consider stressors. And we all know that stress is bad for health. We hear it all the time. Oh my God, stress, lower your stress. Stress is bad for you. Stress is bad for you. And so the idea is that over time, the accumulation of these extra stressors due to your marginalized status places more of a burden on your stress response system and sort of wears it out. And the term that was used for this for years was allostatic load. Allostasis being the sort of the state of homeostasis that your body's always trying to achieve. Like something disrupts you, but then you kind of try to come back down to baseline. And so the idea behind this was that, over time, stress kind of wears down the cells and tissues and organs, and that is what is responsible for these long-term kind of health disparities that you see in marginalized populations. So basically, this is sort of a graphical representation of that model. Like everyone's kind of going along over time, and then boom, a stressor happens, and you respond to it. And, I just put adaptational demand on the y-axis, meaning whatever it is, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your cortisol, your body has to rally to deal with the stressor. And then after it's over, you come back down to baseline and like everything's okay. And then the idea being, well, what's different about marginalized individuals is that they've got more of these events. They're walking through their lives getting more of these events. And so they're getting these repeated hits to their stress response system more than a more privileged person would. And so the way that we typically measure this, there's all these scales that are out there, the everyday discrimination scale, and they all aim to capture how often, in the average week, in the average, over the past 6 months, over the lifetime, how often do you find yourself being treated differently, being discriminated against, being victimized verbally or physically by other individuals. And you count up all these things, and basically by counting up all these stress events and kind of comparing them to the baseline, you have this sense of like, okay, so that's how much stress exposure you have that is taking you away from your calm baseline. And it's those stressors that are harming your health over time. So there were a number of things we got right about this model. Or definitely, we know a lot about the psychobiology of the stress response. We know how stress affects our immune system, how it affects our hormones, how it affects our autonomic nervous system functioning. We're pretty good at that. And what we also got right is that the types and contexts of stressors vary widely. And what may be experienced as a stressor for one person may not be experienced as a stressor by another. That there's a lot of stress that is appraisal. You might go up to a hotel clerk and they might say, oh, we don't have the room that you requested. We have a room that isn't quite as good, but it's, because you checked in late or whatever. And one person might be like, oh my God, that is just like that's an outrage. And another person would be like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. So the objective nature of the event is one thing, and then there's how we appraise it, which is really what kind of predicts how we respond. So that we've gotten better at modeling. We ask about appraisal and all those things. However, what we really got wrong, and we only really realized how wrong we got this, around 2018, 2019, was the baseline. We were wrong by assuming that the natural baseline state for a human is calm, is the absence of stress, is some just happy kind of normal, that's our baseline state. And then stressors, take us off of that. And, because that was I had that misconception like everybody else in the field of health psychology. And this article was published in 2018 that kind of blew the doors off of everybody. And it's called Guts Theory, the Generalized Unsafety Theory of Stress. And it was written by 3 of the leaders in the field who were noticing that there were a lot of inconsistent findings in the research literature where stress exposure at an individual level didn't seem to predict health outcomes. That populations with more stress had poorer health, but at an individual level, it didn't always line up that the person with the most stress exposure had the poorest health. And so they did a deep dive and they concluded that what we got wrong was the baseline. That by assuming that stressors take you off the baseline, if the baseline is calm, we're already on the wrong foot. And they say if you look at us as a species, and if you look at what we now know about the functioning of the stress response system and how the prefrontal cortex responds to stress, we're never calm. The stress response is an inhibitory response, meaning it's always on, except there are tonic inhibitors that occur when we perceive ourselves to be okay. So our baseline state is not calm. Our baseline state is vigilance, and that's turned off when we are in safe environments. Why does this make sense for humans? Because in the environment where we evolved, millions of years ago, nothing was calm. There was no calm. Humans evolved in dangerous, unpredictable, brutal environments. The best baseline assumption of the world is that it's a dangerous one. And so we're vigilant, we're watchful, we're kind of up a little bit until we know we're okay. And only then does our prefrontal cortex say, okay, everyone's off duty. You can relax. We're going to inhibit the sort of stress response. And so what they argue is that really, when you think about the effects of stress on our bodies, it's not individual stressors that take us down. It's the state, the chronic state of being ever prepared for the stressor that you think might be coming, but you don't know when and you don't know where, so you're just kind of in like a clenched fist. And so what they call this is a state of perceived unsafety. You don't know that you're in trouble yet. You just know that you can't assume that you're going to be okay. And this article was not written with marginalized populations in mind. It was just really about our health psychologists' misunderstanding of the way stress affects health. But for me, it was this aha moment of oh my gosh, oh, that makes sense. Because we had noticed in the field of minority stress research the same thing that these authors were pointing out in the stress research literature in general, which was that at an individual level, the number of times that a marginalized person has experienced discrimination, been treated differently, had this or that happen, individual scores on those measures do not predict individual health outcomes. And every time that would happen in a study and be mentioned in the discussion section, be we didn't find that actually individuals with more stress exposure had poorer health. It must be a measurement problem. Maybe we're measuring stress wrong. But this was happening for 20 years. And finally, I had a Post-it note that I stuck on my wall at one point saying, it's not the measure, it's the model. That we have something wrong with the way we're trying to understand how stigma gets under our skin. And I realized, aha, this is it. We're assuming that the reason marginalized individuals are sicker is because they have more of these stress events. And I realized, oh my God, we got it wrong. It's not that they have more stress. It's that they have less safety around them to disinhibit that stress response that is sort of a default stress response. And so basically, you think and the reason that we got this wrong is because humans and psychologists in general, we're also biased by our modern context. In our modern context, extreme stress is rare. We're not facing down like tigers and difficult things in the course of an average day. And so it's easy for us from our privileged spot to be oh yeah, your baseline state is calm. You wake up in your bed and you're all calm, and then you get out of your bed and the stress begins. In the ancestral context, in the context in which humans evolved, we were on alert all the time. Stress and trauma were everywhere. And calm was an unusual state that you kind of had, around the campfire. And so now we're realizing that we have to remember that our brains and bodies evolved in a very different world than the world that we're occupying now. And in a dangerous world, a constant state of vigilance is adaptive. It's beneficial. If you actually do live in a dangerous world, then you had better have all your antenna up all the time. Here's the problem. That is a very taxing, demanding psychobiological state. Stress preparation is actually just as bad for our bodies as stress exposure. At least stress exposure happens and then ends. Stress preparation can be a lifelong state of just always expecting the next bad thing. And so, what that means is like this was never a really good representation of why marginalized folks have poorer health outcomes. It's really more like this. Whether you have a lot of stressors over the course of your day or very few, if you are watchful and wary because you know you do not have the status and privilege that is going to protect you, then you live your life in a state of vigilance that you may not even be aware of. And that's the other thing. Like, vigilance is the kind of feeling you often don't even notice until it goes away. And one example I like to use of this is there was a time that I had a dishwasher repair person come over to my house. And he's like working on the dishwasher. And, I had like pictures, on the walls that like make it clear that, I'm a queer person. And, I don't think about that in the course of a day. Like I don't feel at threat. There was no conscious threat that I was experiencing. And at some point, I go in to figure out what's the status of the dishwasher. And he's like, oh, yeah, I think you're going to have to replace it. And I was like, oh, my God, my wife, didn't want me to buy this dishwasher. And I picked it. So now I'm like in a doghouse. And, and I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm outing myself. I was just talking about it. And he just starts laughing. He's like, oh, my God, my wife is the same way. And like we had this. And he's just like talking to me like I'm a normal person. And all of a sudden, I was aware of like this like letdown in my bodily state. The moment that he laughed and was just like, it was like, oh, he's totally okay. Oh, everything's fine. Now, I would not have said I was stressed out before. I wasn't. But I suddenly could feel that my body was maintaining something that I was not aware of and that I didn't notice until that was lifted. And all of a sudden, there's this like relaxed state. I would argue that most marginalized folks are carrying a state of vigilance around with them that they do not even know they are doing, that it has become so second nature, potentially from when you were a child, that you don't know it's happening. And so there's this unmeasured toll of vigilance that is driving a lot of these health effects, but it's not going to show up on any of these questionnaires that ask you how often you're mistreated. And so it's like for years, the stress literature and the minority stress literature and the marginalization literature has been focusing on like, what are the things, what are the stigma events that hurt us, the harassment, the victimization. We've focused so much effort on capturing those, measuring those, talking about them. And what we have been ignoring is the thousands of minutes and hours and days that transpire between those events, which is when most of the damage is happening, that is happening outside of our conscious awareness of it. And we now know that this state of hypervigilance, like vigilance that's maintained over time, we now know it's associated with a whole bunch of bad things. It disrupts your sleep, as you can imagine, right? If your body is preparing for stress, sleep is a dangerous thing. It saps your attention. There's a lot of discussion of ADHD, and there's a lot of discussion among clinicians that the symptoms of chronic hypervigilance and the symptoms of ADHD look kind of same on the surface. Difficulty maintaining attention, kind of rapid attention shifting. Those are all things that are highly adaptive if you are in an environment where you don't know where the threat is coming from. Those aren't disorders, right? Those aren't deficits. Those are fantastic adaptations that unfortunately have some, challenging kind of side effects, that maintaining that attention constantly saps a lot of energy out of your system. Rumination, that process of going over and over again, like, are they mad at me? Did they look at me in a weird way? We now know that ruminative process actually exacerbates your body's response to stress and is, one of the primary pathways through which stress events can translate into major depressive episodes. the repeated re-experiencing and rumination and trying to figure out, where am I safe? Where am I not? That process is a taxing, costly process. Isolation, if you are constantly vigilant and afraid, a great adaptation is to just hide yourself away, to protect yourself, through isolation or hostility, right? So those are obviously might be adaptive in a dangerous environment, but what kind of life does that lead you if the way that you keep yourself safe is by cutting yourself off from other individuals or having a defensive posture that's like, I'll hurt you before you hurt me? And self-soothing, by the way, substance use. One of the primary reasons that folks report using substances is to calm them down, to bring them down. That heightened vigilance is hard to disrupt once it's sort of entrenched in your nervous system. And so a lot of folks like, well, I can't go to sleep unless I take a substance, because that vigilance has been sort of keeping your nervous system on alert the entire time. So again, when you think about the fact that marginalized communities have higher rates of substance abuse, to some degree, that's medicating, that's self-medication for chronic stigma-related or status-related vigilance. We like to say, oh, there's addicts or there's something wrong with their self-control. Folks with privilege have no idea what sustaining that defensive posture takes out of your body, over time. The good news is that the solution to vigilance is really simple, and it's all around us, and it's other people. It's not a mindfulness app. It's not going for a walk. It's other people, because we are the most social species on the planet. The only form of safety that we really trust is the presence of at least one other person who is with us and communicates that, yeah, they'll protect us. Whatever we're going through, we're not alone. We're okay. Other people. Other people is what we are designed to rely upon. And so this is where the term social safety comes in. It was coined by George Slavich, who was a psychoneuroimmunologist, and who around the same time that guts theory came out, which is basically being like, we're stressed all the time. We're just vigilant all the time. George Slavich's paper came out saying, oh, and you know what is the only thing that brings us down is our perception that there are people around us, people, not screens, people who will protect us, who are connected to us, who love and care for us unconditionally. And it's the unconditional part that is really where dignity comes in. Unconditional means you don't have to earn this. You get it just for being a human, right? If you're standing in front of like the subway tracks and a human falls on the subway tracks, you don't say, do you deserve to be pulled out of the subway tracks? You say, you're a human. No human should be in danger. Let me pull you out. That's really what dignity is about. Everyone deserves it. You don't have to earn it. But as we know, that is not typically how our society operates. That we definitely view some individuals as more worthy of protection and safety and connection than others. And that is where the health disparities come from. That if everyone actually felt connected and protected by the people around them, then our vigilance, would go down. And so Slavich, defines social safety as unconditional social connection, protection, and inclusion. And I want to emphasize the word protection, because there's a lot of discussion of inclusion and inclusivity and include, and you belong, and you belong, and you belong. And all that sounds great, and it's very, very fluffy. But belonging is nothing without protection. Belonging and inclusion mean that because you are with me, if harm comes to you, I will step in. I will step in and protect you. That's what belonging is really about, is not just, I like you, but my arm is around you. You cannot come to harm if I am near. That's really what protection is about. That's what our brains evolved to look for. Not just people who think you are like me, you have the same dignity I have, therefore harm that comes to you is harm that comes to me, and I will protect you from it. And for humans, these are primal needs, and this is what, again, we sort of forget from our modern context. In our modern context, If you want to live your entire life alone, you probably can. You can live alone, you can do all your work online, you could never see another human being. So we have this sense that humans can be independent. We don't need other individuals. That was not true in the ancestral context. Humans are incapable of living alone. There is no place on this planet where humans live alone. We are incapable of surviving alone. We're a group living species. We survive by bonding together. And for a human to be pushed out of the group is a literal death sentence in the ancestral context. If you are left behind by your tribe, if they decide that you're too disgusting to be worthy of sharing the campfire, it's not just inconvenient, it is a death sentence. Humans did not survive alone. Our brains retain that legacy. When we experience someone as rejecting us, it activates our immune system in a way that other stressors don't. And we started to sort of figure this out really around 2010, especially with cortisol, that the strongest trigger for the stress response is a social trigger, is a trigger of other people judging you, looking negatively at you, showing you a facial expression of contempt. If you have someone show you a facial expression of contempt or hostility, you can actually see changes in the inflammation in your bloodstream within 24 hours. Because what Slavich shows is that social connection was so important to our survival as humans that basically our immune system is ever on the alert for social rejection. Because in the ancestral period, if you were being rejected by the group, it meant you were about to be wounded. And so we have a preparatory inflammatory response in our body to people looking at us negatively, to showing us contempt. Because as far as your body is concerned, you're about to get beat up or stabbed. So let's gear up. And what we now know is that little bit of extra inflammation that you experience when you're being socially rejected, that stuff builds up over time. And systemic inflammation, which is sort of what it's called when there's like low-grade inflammation in your body, we now know that 50% of causes of death worldwide have an inflammatory pathway. Systemic inflammation increases your risks for cardiovascular disease, asthma, depression, arthritis, Alzheimer's. It reduces the effects of cancer treatments. Inflammation, broadly speaking, is probably one of the most important sort of health-related biomarkers that we have, and it is highly sensitive to our social relationships. If you want proof that we're a social species, the immune system tells us. And so what Slavich shows is that when we are being rejected or pushed away from other individuals, that's an immunological intervention that is actually going to harm our health and is going to escalate over time. And so our social relationships are not outside our bodies. They are inside our bodies from the very beginning. And this, is another kind of quote on the same topic from a colleague of mine, James Cone. And again, this goes back to the ancestral kind of context. The dominant ecology to which humans are adapted is not any one terrain, diet, or climate, but each other. Social relatedness and its psychological correlates constitute the normal baseline ecology of the functional human brain. So the natural state of humans was basically to be pretty stressed out all the time, but to be surrounded by a clan that was like, it's okay, yeah, it's terrible, but we have each other. Like, that is what humans evolved to expect. That is exactly what is denied from marginalized individuals. All the stress, none of the group, none of that automatic expectation that if I'm in trouble and I knock on a door, someone's going to answer it and help me, right? Privileged folks can take something like that for granted. Marginalized folks cannot. And so because humans are so dependent on other individuals, because this is a part of the legacy of our human brains, when we are rejected or pushed out or stigmatized, it is the deepest cut that a human brain can experience. And we do a terrible job as a society of sort of shaming people for feeling bad about being rejected. Like, oh, buck up, it doesn't matter. For the human brain, there's literally nothing worse. There's literally nothing more frightening than being left alone, pushed away, abandoned by other individuals. I mean, if you can think about a time that you felt ashamed in front of other individuals and that kind of hot feeling where your whole body is reacting and you're like, why am I overreacting to this moment? It's because that is your evolved human brain saying, if you're ashamed, you might die. You might die. And think about the number of individuals who commit suicide after an extremely shameful thing. We evolved a shame sensitivity that is purely a legacy of our social nature. You can't have a species that benefits from social connection without having a species that is terrified of what happens when you lose it. And that's the state of being kind of humans. We view being left behind or pushed out, our bodies experience it as a survival threat, not a stressor, a survival threat, even if it makes no sense, right? We're working with old brain equipment. We retain this legacy. There are studies finding that your brain will start pumping out inflammatory chemicals in response to hostility and shame, even when you subliminally prime it and you're not even consciously aware of seeing it. Your brain will respond to cues of contempt in another person's face, even if they go by so fast that you're not even conscious of perceiving it, right? So a lot of this is happening outside of our conscious awareness. And right now, we're in a huge epidemic of loneliness that started, about 10 years ago. Our social connections started to decline with social media, and they're continuing to decline. And we are seeing health effects of that social isolation. Our relationships are not external, they are biological. When we lack nurturant relationships, we suffer. And so if you think about then how does this change how we view the experience of marginalized groups? It's like, stop focusing on what is extra in their life, stress, discrimination. That all exists, but that's often not an everyday occurrence in the life of a marginalized person. They're not being actively discriminated against by their workplace every single day, often, not ever in a workplace. What does happen every day is moving through the world without some of the routine cues of connection that privileged folks offer and receive all the time. There are studies showing that marginalized folks, even if they just want a shop person to make change, they're often less likely to make change with a marginalized person. So when you're marginalized, you are not getting those everyday cues of inclusion and protection and safety from your social world. But you might not even be aware of that because you may never have even experienced that, right? So you don't know what you're not getting. You don't know what you're lacking. So none of this is going to show up, on any sort of questionnaire. And so even when objective stress exposure is low, marginalized individuals move through the world with their bodies at a state of vigilance and alertness because they're not getting the normal down-regulating functions of social connection. And another kind of way to sort of imagine what this feels like is imagine the last time you were going to an event, or imagine if you were going to this event, you're like, oh, I'm at the right place. And imagine if you came in this room and there was no one in here, and you're like, oh no, I'm in the wrong place. I got something wrong. What? Huh? And you maybe really, and then imagine you saw at the other room one person who was like, oh, it's over here. It's over here. Come, come. I'm sure you know already what that would do to your body, right? Your body would immediately be like, oh. It only takes, we're so waiting for just to be one other person to be like, whatever bad thing is happening, you're not the only one. It only takes one. That's what our brains are sort of waiting for. And that is what is being denied marginalized groups every day. That whatever's happening to you, good luck. Good luck. You're on your own. But they may not even know that there's a different way, to exist. Now, a lot of people are like, well, this doesn't make sense because things are so much better now. It's so much more accepting than it used to be. Um, you know, sometimes, right, in some places, one of the things we also now know from the generalized unsafety theory of stress, is that the primary trigger for vigilance is uncertainty, is not knowing whether you're okay or not. And if you have any doubt about the way uncertainty can hijack your brain and body, just look at that. Just kind of imagine those dots vibrating. Think about how you feel when you're looking at those dots and you're like, no, I can't do anything. I can't do anything at all until this is resolved. And then, God forbid, it goes away. It's going to ruin your whole day. Our brains are wired to prioritize uncertainty because we evolved in an unpredictable environment. Unpredictability is threatening. One of the reasons that we're all freaked out now is because a lot of things that used to be predictable have suddenly become kind of unpredictable. Humans don't like unpredictability. We hate it. That's what makes us ruminate over and over and over again. And so, yes, there are pockets of the world that are way more accepting of marginalized groups than they used to be. And there are other pockets that are not. And so marginalized individuals are moving every day through a highly uncertain and unpredictable world, which is just a recipe for more vigilance. It's like, is this place okay? Is that person okay? What can I actually kind of do about this? And so I think one way to think about what is the state of being marginalized, it's not necessarily the state of being exposed to more stress. It's the state of constantly being uncertain as to your safety with the people around you, uncertain as to whether you actually have dignity in the eyes of the people around you. That uncertainty moving through your entire life is what keeps that vigilance high. I don't know, might be okay, maybe not. And so what do a lot of folks do to deal with this uncertainty? They often overperform. They do things like checking, monitoring the people around you. I'll change the way I dress, I'll change the way I speak. How can I make my safety more certain? These sorts of behaviors, here's the other side effect. Often, if marginalized individuals get really, really good at monitoring their safety and doing what they can to placate people in power so that they can secure their safety, well, A, these are really taxing behaviors too. B, they often contribute to that idea of like, oh, well, this is one of the good ones. They talk like us, they walk like us, they seem like us. So certainly individuals can perform their way into a sense of safety. That is a toxic and demanding process too, because it basically communicates your safety is not unconditional. You only have it as long as you follow certain rules about how you're supposed to show up in a certain setting, as long as you don't disrupt things, too often. And so often we were like, oh, look at how many marginalized folks we have in this setting. We're doing a great job. And I'm always like, how are they doing? Are they walking around like this? Because let me tell you, that's how I spent the first 10 years of my career, being like, I'm going to dress as normal. And I de-spiked I'm like, I want to be as acceptable to other people as I possibly can. Seems like a good idea at the time. I had no idea what toll that would take on my body and brain, over decades. Those things are taxing over time. So I want to show some examples of what I think this routine unsafety kind of feels like in an everyday context. People not noticing if you're present or absent, right? Do they even care? If I disappear, would anybody, even notice? Not getting timely responses from supervisors. Once I started doing this work, I became much better about telling my own graduate students, I will give you feedback on this day. I'm not going to have you wonder when is she I can't read it now, but I'll tell you when I will read it so that you don't spend the next week going, did she hate it? Is she going to email me? I'm like, uncertainty is toxic. I don't want anyone, to experience it. People not really showing that they don't understand the holidays or the cultural symbols that are important to your community, that they don't see certain parts of your background. Being the only person of almost anything at a workplace, the only queer person, the only first gen students, having a sense of, I'm not really of this group, I'm an outlier, I'm different in some way. People never really showing an interest in you as a human being, as a whole person. There's all this talk about like bringing your whole self to work. And we were like, oh, why do we have to do these social events? And I'm like, because that is how we remind one another that at the end of the day, we're humans. We're humans. We all are human. We have families. We have lives. We have knees that hurt. We like mac and cheese, right? When we do these human things and we gather together, those are potentially episodes to remind one another of our dignity, to say, whatever else we're doing, we're also just basic humans who like to do things on the weekends, who have laundry, who have stuff, reminding one another of our kind of common humanity. Those are dignity interventions, at this very kind of basic level. And this is another thing that happens. It's like people become, and again, people aren't necessarily intending to make anybody feel excluded. But when certain events in the news make people kind of locate you as being in a group, and they're like, how are you doing since this and that was happening? And it comes from a good place, but unfortunately, all it does is just remind the person of like, yeah, I guess I'm a part of that group. And you're concerned about that group, but I'm, I guess, not a part of your group. And again, this has nothing to do with like people's intentions. Our brains are so wired for connection and rejection that these things have an outsized impact on our functioning because, again, we have these old, evolved human brains. People not just even like chit-chatting with you. Just like, you walk into the break room, you get a snack, no one says anything to you. And is that a stressor? No one says you have to. But it's that sense of when I move through the world, does anybody see me? Does anyone treat me as like a person that's even worth saying, hey, how was your day? Those are not small things. Those are not small things. We call it small talk. That's dignity talk. Are you worth talking to? Are you worth communicating with? I used to be the kind of person that was always very uncomfortable talking to strangers. I used to hate it. But since I started doing this work, now I aggressively talk to like every stranger. Like I'm just a terror in the airport. But let me tell you, there is not a single time when I haven't made the effort to just connect with a stranger on a human level. There's not a single time that the response hasn't been so positive and so kind of moment changing. It's like even things like, and I fly Southwest and like you have to line up in numerical order. And for some of us, that's really hard. And you can tell that some people are trying to read other person's boarding pass to see, should I be ahead of this person or behind? Instead of just saying, I'm 48, are you 47? And so now I'll just be like, hi, I'm 32. Where are you? Like, where are you going? But here's the thing, like, I was like, wow, why was I so afraid of this before? Humans are dying to connect with other humans. We're addicted to each other. We really are. But we all carry a little bit of that self-protection. It doesn't take much to begin to sort of break it down. So I want to skip ahead to the really hopeful part because I have homework for all of you that is related to how you can sort of apply this in your own everyday life. Because some of these, some of the solutions that we need to move toward are institutional and some of them are personal, right? I think, one answer to everything I've shown you is how do we kind of promote health? We need to find a way to get the sort of appreciation for human dignity back into our institutions and our personal functioning. We are a polarized nation right now, that is clear. And we're a nation that is still suffering from the effects of the pandemic, where we started seeing people on screens all the time. And you know what really saps your sense of another person's dignity? Never seeing anything below their kind of collarbone. They're not humans. They don't have legs or dogs or anything. They're just a face on a screen. It is hard to see the humanity of people that you only see online. And so a lot of companies have been struggling to get people to come back to work in person. And it's because that's one way that we remind one another of our dignity, is to see our actual physical selves and, bump into each other. So some of what we need to do is to prioritize recognition of human dignity, really sort of increase our understanding that when you have any sort of institution, that institution is made up of humans at the end of the day, not data points, actual humans, and that there is no substitute for a human brain for warm contact with other humans. It's what every cell in our brains is looking for and waiting for, and no screen will do it. Getting support on a screen is better than no support, but we really do need to prioritize more in-person time. And so, with that in mind, here's your homework. So here's a little spider web, little drops of water on it. And I like, the shape of this. You can imagine your own social network. You've got people who are really close to you, who are in that sort of that inner circle of little dots. And there's a lot of dots of water there. It's like, that's where you get most of your nurturance, is from the people that are closest to you. However, then you have the next layer. Then you have your family or intimates. Then you have your closest friends. And that's another circle of little drops of water. And then there's a circle around that, like maybe your colleagues or people a little further out. And I think especially after the pandemic, most of us put a lot of our energy and investment in the drops of water that were closest to us, the bonds that were closest to us, which is great. Those bonds are hugely important. But one of the fastest ways to make a radical change in your life and the lives of other individuals is to invest a little more time and attention in some of those ancillary drops, some of the ones that are a little bit on the outside. That, those are the ones that really fell off during the pandemic. Like a lot of us just let those shrivel up. But they are important. They're a part of that community level understanding that we are not just individuals who have family members. We are part of a larger social collective. So this is the homework that I'm going to task you with. I want you to sort of think about your own web of people. Draw it out. Get a piece of paper. Who are the closest people? The next circle out. People you regularly see that it's like, and you'll find people who, oh yeah, I like that person. I don't see them very often, but I really like them. I really connect with them. Or this person I see all the time, or whatever it is. Take a look at your web and pick 2 little nodes, 2 people that you like, that maybe that's a relationship that you'd like it to be a closer or a better relationship it is. Think is there a way that I can be sort of like a better friend to this person? Can I be a more reliable source of water, a safer person for this individual? Can I be more consistent? Can I not leave that person's emails, unresponded to? What can I do to increase feelings of belonging and reduce uncertainty for this individual? And it's not that difficult. If you want one rule for how to deepen your connection to a person, spend more time with them in person. That's basically it. You don't really have to do much. Check in with them. Go to coffee. Show up. Just be a human and recognize their own humanness. It's really not that complicated. And the key here is that safety is created by the sense that a person is always going to be consistent in the way that they respond to you. We don't feel safe with people who are sometimes fantastic and then sometimes they won't respond to your text for weeks. That just creates uncertainty. So a part of investing in a connection is saying, I'm always going to be a reliable person for that person. I'm not going to keep canceling plans on them. I'm going to be really intentional and give it a year. Give it a year. Be like, I'm just going to create more safety for this person, create more companionship, show up a little bit more, check in, have some unstructured time where we're just gabbing. That's not wasted time, by the way. Gabbing comfortably with people you feel safe with is an immune system intervention, right? It's creating that with you, I can sync, into my chair and relax and turn my vigilance down. That's a mental health intervention that you're doing when you do that. The other thing that is, relevant is to try to pick a person that maybe doesn't have that many in-person connections. We've all lost a lot of them since the pandemic. We have fewer day-to-day social connections than we used to. And we think to ourselves, oh, that doesn't matter. Like, I still see my closest friends all the time. It does matter. We do need to see more people more of the time to remind one another of our own dignity. But the group that is most vulnerable are the individuals who really have nowhere to turn, no person that is really safe for them. And so I think especially for folks who work with youth, I tell this to teachers and coaches all the time. You have the capacity to be the one place in the school that kid knows, oh, that door is always open. Like, that person I can always go to. And for a lot of kids in schools, it's not even a teacher. It may be like, the janitor or someone who does something with the physical plant. Every single one of us has within us the capacity to be the one person that another person can go to, that they know is going to be a warm, affirmative thing. Being the one person that someone can turn to could potentially be the biggest amount of social change that you will ever do in your life, because it's literally life-changing. We know from studies of youth that it only takes one to be transformative, to make the difference between, getting out of a bad situation and not. And here's the other magical thing. You do not need to have complete safety yourself to offer it to another, right? You can be a little bit not sure yourself, but simply by bonding with another person, you've made both of you feel a little safer, right? These are interventions that all of us can do with zero money, with zero planning. You can start this today. And I will tell you, because I give this advice a lot, I get emails all the time from people saying, you know what, I just decided to do that, and it changed my life. Like, I can't believe how fast it changed things. Like, all I started doing was deciding to reach out to the people I already kind of liked. And this woman said in 6 months, it turned my whole world around. And she's like, now I'm addicted to it, and I'm telling other people to do it. During a time that we all feel like there's not a lot we can do, oh my goodness, this is something we all can do. This is something you can start today. And I think once you start to do it, you realize, oh my God, it doesn't even just need to be for the people in my life. It's the people at the grocery store. It's the people at the airport. That reinvigorating our appreciation for human dignity is something that if we really take it seriously personally, then I think the institutional change will be a lot easier, because we all have to remind ourselves of what those connections feel like. We've forgotten a lot of that. We spend a lot of our time on screens. So experiment with this. Think about what it's like to offer safety to other individuals. Notice how it makes you feel. Keep an eye on how you hold your body as you're moving through the world, and when you're vigilant and when you're not. Folks are like, well, what's like the one key take home kind of message from this? I'm like, everybody needs to put their brain in a safe social space for at least some time each day. For theoretically, it ought to be your own home, right? Where you can go home and go to sleep and your brain kind of shuts down. For a lot of individuals, the home may not be the safest place. That's fine as long as there is one. As long as there is one. And so what I tell the folks who are in really bad circumstances is figure out who are the people that give you that feeling where you can feel your body let down when you're with them. Spend more time in person with that person. It's a brain intervention. Everyone needs a certain amount of safety for our bodies to rest and recover and restore. And that is what, as a community, we can start to reknit one by one, and then institutionally to see if we can reinvigorate our human dignity and our access to safety for all. Thank you.